Hi and welcome to Midnight Cry, a program that is committed to speaking the truth in love. I'm your host, Rommel Gussain, and today we have with us Beth Grove, who will be discussing with us some of the internal debates on a woman's role within Islam. First of all, welcome to the show, Beth.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now, we've been able to discuss a number of different topics, and I think this one is quite fascinating because a lot of the times when people look at the different roles of women within Islam, they think that Islam is quite united on this issue.
Yeah.
But that's not the case, is it?
Yeah, I thought the same before I learnt about Islam, before I met Muslims, before I started talking to Muslims. And I've talked to many kinds of Muslims, from your converts to people from Pakistan, from India, from Arabia, from Africa. And
wow.
As I began to talk with all these different kinds of Muslims from different countries, I began to realize that whilst there's some theologies that are quite similar, there's different viewpoints and interpretations of their religion. And I also began to pick up that some people were extremely modern and what I would call westernized, and then others were extremely traditional, and some would wear the niqab and you could just see their eyes, and some of the men would be wearing the long robes and the beards, and then there'd be others who would be, again, looking very Western or looking very modern. And so I began to realize that there's quite a lot of interpretations of this religion. And so it fascinated me so much, and one of the reasons I decided to actually study this area for my thesis is because I was watching a program once on a program in London. And I was listening to the Muslim presenter, and she was traveling around the Muslim world looking at the position of women in the Muslim world. And she traveled from Egypt all the way through to Asia, to Turkey, etc. And I began to see how she was interpreting some of the more difficult aspects of her religion, and even opening the Quran, and the main verse, of course, she went to was Surah 434, which is that famous verse about how a husband can discipline his wife, and how she interpreted that. I thought, wow, that's I couldn't see how she came to her conclusions, but I realized that there was a lot of women themselves, Muslim women themselves, trying to find ways to interpret and reinterpret their religion to make it relevant for society today. So that just opened this whole area of study and interest for me, and that's why I did my postgrad studies on it.
So then, who are some of the principal women who discuss and engage in some of these debates and these topics?
Well, there are many, or certainly there's a growing number. There are not many, but there's a growing number. And it isn't actually always women, but certainly those who are more, those women who want to see much more freedom for women within Islam. Most of them would be women. And then those who are holding on to traditional values, of course, a lot of those theologians are men. But there are men as well who support a more, what we would say, a modernist position. And they're different names. You can name a modernist, progressive, feminist. They're different titles. You can't put any theology, if you like, or any particular position in a box, but just calling them modernists just helps us to understand who we're talking about.
Yes. The
modernists are those who want to reinterpret Islam, and there is an Arabic saying, they call it ijtihad, and basically it's an interpretation, and you don't go to the traditional scholars, so it's an independent interpretation. And a lot of modernist Muslim women want to reopen this, because traditional scholars say, no, that was shut down in the 10th century during the time of the Mutazilites. Now that's a whole nother theology and debates that were happening in the 10th century with a group called Mutazilites. That's for another program. But they want to reopen this debate, whilst those who hold on to a more traditional position of Islam, they want to keep back to what the theology that was formed up to the 10th century and hold on to that. And there's many names. Some of the women that are quite interesting to read. One of my favorites is a woman called Amina Wadud, and she is based in America. And she has, I think, written some of the best feminist writings of Islam.
As a Muslim?
As a Muslim woman,
Okay,
as a Muslim
yes.
woman, yes. Some of what she says, I can see how she could come to some of her conclusions. But for example, she says something very fascinating in one of her books. I think it's called Gender Jihad, and I believe it's around page 92 or something like that. I was so struck by it, I remember the page number. And she said, there are some verses in the Quran we must simply say no to. And because she realizes there are some verses in the Quran that are so detrimental to the health of women and so detrimental to the freedoms of women that we must simply say no to them. And that was Surah 2, Ayah 223, which is a verse on tilth and male sexuality in marriage, and how a man can go to his wife anytime he wants, anyhow he wants. And many modernist Muslim women are very concerned about verses like this because it's so pro-male and really it can almost be offensive when you really begin to unpack what these verses mean. So there's women like her, Amina Wadud, and then on the other side you would have a traditionalist. There's one man from India, and his name's Abdul Rahman Doi, and he says how actually, Islam has ennobled women by putting limitations on women. And so these limitations on women protect them. And this is what Amina Wadud and others like her are trying to confront, saying these limitations are not right. And they're trying to say, in fact, these limitations are not Islamic.
Yes, it's actually segregation.
Yes.
Really, yes. And so people like that really, I mean, would they be seen by traditional Muslims as being sort of apostate or heretics or something like that? Or
some of them have been, yes. And I mean, certainly there's one in Canada right now that has been considered really that she's not a Muslim, and she's a homosexual, so she would be on the extreme end. So a lot of Muslims would just say, "Oh no, not a Muslim."
Yes.
But she calls herself a Muslim, and she lives in Canada, and she's a very outspoken feminist. And she says that Islam is an Arabized religion. It's all Arab, and it's Arab imperialism is her particular point with Islam. You have others like others who are not scholars, but you have other women like Queen Rania of Jordan. She's not a scholar, but she's a queen, and she obviously lives a very luxurious lifestyle, and her lifestyle would not be normal for the average woman, say in Jordan.
Typical, yes.
Yeah, it would not be typical. But she also wants to see women's rights be brought into the open. And what Islam really talks about when it talks about women is justice for women. And in fact, some traditionalist Muslims say it isn't about necessarily women having freedoms in the public sphere or getting into business or politics. It's about justice for women.
It almost sounds like some people, or some of these women are trying to evolve the religion from within. They're trying to change it.
Absolutely.
So it's more relative for the 21st century.
But this is the interesting thing. When you look at Islam, in order to make it relevant for the 21st century, you have to do what Amina Wadud is doing and say no to some of the Quranic verses and say no to some of the hadith, some of the sayings of Muhammad, some of the traditions. And some of the modernist Muslim scholars are actually beginning to find ways to show that the hadith, that the Sahih hadith, the hadith that is considered authoritative, to try actually discredit it and show how, oh no, that's not authoritative. And of course, it's the difficult sayings. For example, Muhammad said an omen is in a woman, a horse, etc., and in a woman, and a house. Muhammad also said, I have not left an affliction to men more detrimental to men than a woman. So a woman is the affliction that's detrimental to men.
Wow.
Women are less intelligent. Women's the religion of a woman is half that of a man, etc., etc. And those are all from Sahih Bukhari, volume 4, volume 7, etc. And so there's these very difficult sayings, and there's another hadith where it says, where if a husband calls his wife to sleep with him and she refuses, the angels send curses on her till the morning. So there's all these sorts of hadith which feminist and modernist Muslim women are very aware of, and they are deeply concerned about, and they want to try discredit them and say this can't be what Muhammad said, or say it's not applicable for today. But what's interesting, I like to compare that with the Bible,
yes,
because the more literally you apply the Bible, the more you go back to Scripture, the more women are ennobled and freed. Whilst with the Quran, the more you go back to the Quran and the more you apply the Quran literally, the more women are suppressed.
Yes.
It's a very key point. Yeah.
That's right. And I think we had the opportunity to talk about a little bit, somewhat, of how Scripture truly ennobles a woman. I mean, God really values, He values both male and female, and we're being created in His image. And I think you pointed out and you mentioned Proverbs chapter 31, and this is something that is quite close to the heart of many Christians. And I remember myself, reading this with my own wife, studying it with my own wife, rather than going through the whole chapter, but I just want to point out some of those verses which people are quite familiar with. So Proverbs chapter 31, verse 10, and we read there, "Who can find a virtuous wife? For her worth is far more than rubies. The heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil." And so you can see there how a woman is being esteemed, and that her value, it's far greater than any earthly treasure. You can't compare it to any earthly treasure. And I think it's such a wonderful way to be able to see, the Old Testament, which a lot of people would say, it's not relative for today, to see how it describes as someone who is virtuous.
Well, I would love to point some of these
Yes.
modernist women to this chapter,
Yes,
because
yes.
what they are seeking for in Islam is in this chapter. I mean, if you go further on in the chapter, it talks about how she's a successful businesswoman and how she buys a vineyard and she goes out and she sees that her trading is profitable, and how she makes sure her family's okay, and she's also respected at the city gates, as is her husband respected at the city gates. So I'd love to point modernist Muslims to this chapter, because this is what they're looking for. A woman who can be both a mother in the home and also having a business.
Yes, that's right. And so, I mean, I've heard some Muslims who point to Aisha as being a primary role model for modern Muslims. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting that some people will point to Aisha. There's another scholar of Islam called Layla Ahmad, and she's written some good work on this, and Fatima Manisi. She's Moroccan, I believe. And they have looked at Aisha, and they come up with a bit of a conflicting view of what she represents. On the one hand, they say she represents the diminishing roles for women in the public sphere, and how women's roles began to become more and more isolated into the home.
Yes.
But on the other hand, they then say, but she transmitted 3,000 hadith, and she was a leader of men, and she recalled a lot of what Muhammad said. My answer to that would be, yes, she did actually, she did transmit, well, she possibly did transmit 3,000 hadith, or sayings of Muhammad. But then, of course, she was the favorite wife. She was often with Muhammad. In fact, Muhammad died in her arms, it says in one hadith. And so she would have known what Muhammad thought, and he would have shared a lot more with her than with any other wife. Also, if you read some of those hadith, you will find that she's retelling stories of when Muhammad was unhappy with them, or when she was she was jealous. She had a terrible problem with jealousy. And there was a very beautiful wife that Muhammad was going to take on. And Aisha had seen this woman, Juraira, and she was so filled with jealous because she thought, Muhammad's going to see the beauty I see in this woman. And so there's a lot of jealousy as he took on other women. And so there was some disharmony in the Muhammadan household. And Aisha, these are some of the hadith that Aisha has transmitted. So when Muslims say to me, oh, well, Aisha transmitted 3,000 hadith, I said, have you read some of those hadith? Then they don't edify Aisha. They don't edify the other wives. So it's not necessarily a positive thing just because the number is big. The hadiths of what she's sometimes transmitting do not ennoble women.
Yes, that's right. I mean, when you learn or listen to things such as this, you can understand why there are so many tensions from within.
Yes.
And you would naturally, especially if you're someone that has been brought up in the West, you're taught to question, to critique, to understand things. And so it's not just simply a case of blindly accepting what has been prescribed to you, but you want to know why. You want to understand why. And I think this is a beautiful thing when you look at Christianity, is that God does not instruct us to do something unless there is a purpose and a reason for doing it. It's not just simply, something that's there which would just, it can bring harm to ourselves, or it's just a decree for no reason. And I think even when we look at the commandments themselves, even the laws that God had given to Moses, which Muslims do recognize, when we think of, one of the laws which says don't murder. Well, why shouldn't you murder? Because you're taking someone's life away. Well, don't bear false testimony. Well, why shouldn't you lie? Because you're not telling the truth. Why shouldn't you commit adultery? Don't commit adultery, because you're tearing up a home. And so we can see that there are reasons for why God has put these laws down. And they're not something that are just sort of one-sided or bent to a particular gender. No.
And they don't cause division.
Exactly.
But the Islamic rules cause division. Men and women segregate.
Yes.
And society segregates. But whilst the biblical laws are in place, and Jesus sums up the law, doesn't he? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind.
Yes.
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Yes.
And it's all about loving God, loving fellow humans. That's why the law is there.
That's right.
But Islamic law is quite different.
Yes. And so please tell us a little bit more about Aisha. When did Muhammad marry her? Tell us a little bit about her life.
Well, a lot of people do know that Aisha was first married either at 6 or 7. We're not exactly sure which age, depends on what hadith you read. And the marriage was consummated at 9 years old. Now, Muslims will be very quick to say, oh, but she started her menstruation, so she was considered biologically a woman.
Okay.
That may be. However, there is a hadith where it says that Muhammad would come when Aisha was playing with the girls and playing with her dolls, and then Muhammad would come to her. And I find that quite disturbing, because even if she has started her menstruation, she's a little girl playing with her friends and her dolls. And so I don't believe she was a girl ready for marriage. But there's also a Quranic verse I'd like to read, and it's Surah 65.
As you bring that up, so do Muslims know that her age when she was given in marriage?
Yes,
this is well known.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of the scholars in London and some of the missionaries in London actually believe it's okay to marry 10-year-olds. Okay. And they will preach at Speaker's Corner, where we go down sometimes, and they will preach at Speaker's Corner, it's okay to marry 10-year-olds. And my question is this: if Muhammad is the role model for today, does that mean then 53-year-old men, because he was 53 at the time, are allowed to marry 10-year-olds.
Yes.
And most people in our society, in Western society, and I think in a lot of Asian and Eastern society, would be appalled at such a thought. So he cannot be a role model for today if we take that example of how he married a little girl so young. But let me read this verse. It's in Surah 65, verse 4, it says this: "And those of your women as have passed the age of monthly courses, for them the iddah, and if you have any doubt, 3 months, the iddah is the waiting period.
Okay.
And for those who have no courses, and the people who've edited this Quran or put together this Quran, Hilali and Khan, this is from Saudi Arabia, this particular Quran, they put in brackets, they are still immature. So as an underage, they haven't even started their menstruation. Their iddah is 3 months. And so there is a debate, it's not a clear debate, but there is a debate that there seems to be some implication in the Quran that even wives who are underage or have no menses yet can be divorced. And that's very concerning. It's not laid out black and white, but there is a hint there. And certainly in the hadith, we know in the hadith, Al-Tirmidhi, which is one of the well-known hadith, people go back to Al-Tirmidhi, and he says that women or girls who had not started menstruation could be married. So in the traditions of Islam, a lot of the scholars and the early writers accepted that it was young women. Whether she had her menses or not, the fact is she's still 9 years old.
Yes.
Is that a model for today? And I would say no, absolutely not.
Yes, and even though I suppose it wasn't a typical example, but the fact that we know about it and it's there often leads people to put a question mark over it. I mean, when you think of it, I mean, any person that has had children, I mean, at that age, they're so tender, so innocent. They're not aware. They're not ready for motherhood. They're not ready for marriage. You know, there are so many things that they're quite not aware of.
Well, biologically, it causes without going into any detail, it can cause damage for life, a physical damage for life, if a man is sleeping with a child. So it even from a medical point of view, it's an extremely dangerous thing to be with a child so young.
Yes. I think when people often look at Islam and the role of a woman, often they're thinking about the role of a woman within the home as opposed to her public sphere.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I think there are a lot of questions there, and it seems to be there's a lot of difference, isn't there? Between the private and the public.
Yes, and this is where the debate is on. Your traditionalist debaters and your traditionalists and your modernists. And your modernists are really emphasizing that women can enter the public sphere of life. It's career, politics, opportunities, and
whether a woman can drive.
Absolutely,
you know,
and not have to ask a husband, like in Saudi Arabia, but she can just go and drive without asking permission. And then the traditionalists are holding on to a woman's role is in the home, and she must be married. I mean, Muhammad said that my way is marriage, and anyone who is of me. So if you're of Muhammad, you marry. Most Muslims accept that, and even modernist Muslims accept that they need to get married. And then it talks about how it's very much in the home, and how it says, many traditionalists say she can enter the public sphere as long as she abides by these boundaries that Islam has put in place, which would be segregation from men. If she's a scholar, she can teach women. If she's a teacher, she teaches women. But it's still segregation from men. So there's a lot of boundaries according to traditionalists, even if she was to move into the public sphere. And that's where the big tug of war is going on.
That's right. And it really makes you ask that, you know, God is concerned about our hearts. And if we truly love Him and we truly want to honor our God, then the walls that we perhaps might put up, or the rules that we might put up, regardless of these things, we're still going to have an impurity, and we're still going to do the same things that we do. We're still going to think the same way, regardless of where we are at, what we wear, and so on and so on.
External rules, external regulations do not change our hearts.
Yes.
And this is why I ask these questions, where Islam has put these prescribed rules and regulations in. Has it changed some people's hearts? And for the modernists who are seeking to be allowed freedoms, I say come back to the Bible, come back to Jesus Christ.
Yes.
Because the freedoms are not in the Quran. You cannot find them in the Quran. You find them in the Bible. You find them in the way Jesus interacted with women, and how the gospel writers, the people after Jesus who wrote the gospel down, the good news of Jesus down, how they interacted with women. And I say to those modernist women, come back to the Bible, find freedom. And I say to those who are trying to bring purity by segregating, etc., men and women, come back to the Bible, because that's where you get purity.
That's right. Beth, we've come to the end of the episode. Thank you. It's always a pleasure. It's always interesting to have these conversations with you.
Yeah, I love to unpack our theologies of our different religions, because I want Muslims to just really love Jesus and see the freedom they can have in Him.
Yes. To the women especially that are watching this episode, I would urge you to have a look at these subjects, to study these things. Are these things true? Is there tension? Is there question marks that can be placed over some of the things that Islam truly does teach? And if you do find that there are some question marks, well then do have a look at what the Bible does say. We want you to compare and to contrast. If you believe that you have the truth, then you shouldn't be afraid, but that you should be able to go and read what the Bible says, and you can see where there might be a wrong or where there might be a right. We believe that truly that Christianity is the religion which God has passed down to us, and Jesus Christ is Lord. And we hope that you would come to know Him as your personal Saviour. So please stay in tune for the very next episode of Midnight Cry. And until then,